You never really know, but I think it's happening now. Greetings, friends. Welcome to StarryTelling Hour. That's right, it's 11:11 a.m. Pacific Time on Wednesday, Mercury's Day, and therefore StarryTelling Hour with Gemini Brett. And I'm really excited to have an amazing guest here today, Anne Wohlcke, Dr. Anne Wohlcke, HistoryAnne. So, woke up, everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Or is it the new year?
Or is it? Is it happy? That we want to say yes. And yeah, it's funny. Yesterday I was, so December 30th, I don't know, 5 a.m. or something here in California time. I was watching the fireworks, the fireworks go off in Australia.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, dang, we're not having New Year's for a while here still. So it's such a strange thing. And it's something I speak about often, which is just how weird that most of us anyway, this calendar that most of us are using, this Gregorian calendar thing, has a New Year's moment that's not a moment, but rather a series of moments, right? It's not an actual astronomical thing. It's just this date that, requires a calendar flip according to your own time zone, right?
Yeah.
And where are you in?
I'm in California, but I'm in
Where
Southern
in
California.
California?
I'm in Orange.
Right, and I'm up in Richmond in the Bay Area, so we have the same time zone, and same as Nevada, right? Half the year, same as Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like we're all experiencing sunrise at the same time. Like the example I like to use where I live is Sacramento. Is like it's a good drive to go east there from me, or even further to like Lake Tahoe.
Mm-hmm.
And they definitely experience the sun rising before I do here. And yet, we just look at this clock time thing. And we need it, there would be no 11:11 a.m. without it. There would be no way to make our Zoom meetings and our planes and trains and all that stuff. You're a teacher when the students get to class, right? Like it's definitely convenient to have a system of time zones, but it would make sense for us to celebrate an actual global moment, like a solstice or an equinox, which most of us do.
Mm-hmm.
When is New Year's to you, Anne?
What is New Year's, or when is
New Year's?
I always feel the new year at the winter solstice. And I think it's because I haven't experienced being at one of the old megalithic sites at a solstice or equinox, but I did visit Newgrange, which is a passage tomb near Dublin, Ireland. And going into the tomb and experiencing being in that really ancient chamber that's even older than pyramids, when you see the architecture that went into building something like that and going through all the pains of lining it up to the day of the solstice so that the light would reach all the way through the chamber and hit the back of this chamber. And to see even the slope of the earth as you go into the back of the tomb, it sort of slopes down and comes up a little bit. Just to experience that, I was like, wow. And then you come back out. It's very claustrophobic. And especially for a Californian, you look up and you see all these rocks above you that have been in place for years and years, but you think, is this the day there's going to be an earthquake and we will all be buried under a pile of rocks? That's my California mindset that I brought with me there. Because of course you worry it's going to happen the minute you're in there, right? So that was a momentary worry. And then it was just amazing to be in that tomb and to go into this large chamber and then to walk back out of it again and to feel like I've been born again. Like it literally felt like you're coming back out of the birth canal. So that was when I thought, oh, I've always thought, right, we've all seen how the church conveniently placed a lot of feast days and festivals right around these days that have astronomical importance and seasonal importance. So, but at that point, to have experienced it, I'm the type of person who I love to see it and experience it and to feel what it's like. I was just like, okay, I get it now. I get the whole story of the sun coming back and it being like a rebirth. So,
yeah, I mean, church conveniently used these old dates or magically used these old dates and kept the tradition alive.
yeah.
You know, I think it's really easy to fall into, oh, well, the patriarchy's just dominated time and given us this inharmonic, weird Julian calendar that didn't even work. So it needed a Gregorian update and whatnot. But actually, there's beauty to it as well. The more I kind of connect to solar time, the more I see the sense to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Newgrange is amazing. Have you been in the Great Pyramid?
No, have
In
you?
Giza? I have, yeah. I mean, that's like
Okay.
a few more stones to be under, right? And
Exactly.
some would claim it's older than Newgrange. It's certainly not the accepted date of the building of the Great Pyramids, but
Right.
they in Newgrange in Ireland, right? There's a series of passage graves that you mentioned. So there's Noth and Doth nearby,
Mm-hmm.
and they have winter solstice at Newgrange, and then there's equinox alignments at one of them, and a summer solstice alignment at the other. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are sites that you can use to kind of keep the year. I mean, amazingly, they're old enough that they don't track the exact solstices anymore because
Right.
the tilt angle of the Earth has changed a little bit since back then. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a theory that the so-called Queen's pyramids in Giza also worked the equinox and solstice
Hmm.
sunrises, which is pretty cool. So like the Sphinx, for example, is staring due east, and very sadly at a Pizza Hut these days, right?
A
And
Pizza Hut. Okay,
yeah,
that really
like
destroys
the
my whole
Sphinx is like
image.
looking at Pizza Hut, right? And you know, not too tall, but a bunch of buildings are there, and Giza and Cairo beyond. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and back in the day, we can assume, I mean, we know it was a more flat horizon, desert horizon, right? But the way that this works, it's really beautiful because the sun dance on the horizon throughout the course of the year, like we just had the sun at its most southern bounds. That's the Tropic of Capricorn, right? Where the sun stops. That's solstice, turns around, which is what tropikos means in Greek. And then it starts heading north for 6 months, right? And then the northern bounds is the Tropic of Cancer, okay, hence the tropical zodiac, right? When the sun ingresses tropical Capricorn, is shining above Earth's Tropic of Capricorn. And the way that we can experience that on the horizons, whether you're at a stone circle or not, right? Like I have a hill over here I call Solstice Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a tree on that hill I call the birthing tree because it's where the Capricorn solstice or the solstice sun sets. And it's like the furthest southern extreme of the sun, longest night. And for us in the northern hemisphere, of course. And then it's going to start moving north for 6 months, you know? And so I have my own, you know, stone circle, which is just, I'm gifted in the place where I live now to be able to see the sunset every day of the year. And so I can just track where the sun is on the horizons. And I know what sign the sun is in by watching where it sets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ancients have worked with this for a long time and have aligned sites. So you're standing in a particular place, and the Capricorn solstice would set or rise there, and then the equinox there, and the Cancer solstice there, right? And we see that from the Mayan people in India. I mean, all over modern day Mesoamerica, and the British Isles, and France. I mean, it's everywhere around the world
Mm-hmm.
because keeping time is a wise thing to do if you like food, right? Like if you, or whether you're nomadic and you need to know when to go to find the herd or the berries on the bush, or you're agricultural and you need to know when to plant and sow, like you better keep the days, right? And so
Right.
that's
Yeah.
like how calendars were born.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but let me just to finish this image, and it's hard to do this without something pictorial, and I just don't have. I'm looking for stuff around. I don't necessarily have things, but basically the way that it worked is the Great Pyramid, right, which has this just eastern face. It's perfectly aligned to the cardinal directions. Would have these three small pyramids in front of it that they call the Queen's pyramids, And when the sun rises at solstice, like over there, it casts the shadow of all three of those pyramids onto the face of the Great Pyramid. But at equinox time, when it's rising over here, it only casts the shadow of two of them. And at the other solstice, at the North solstice, when it rises over here, it only casts the shadow of one pyramid. So seeing like the different shadows of these pyramids not only tells you that the sun is rising, but also tells you where you are in the year. This is a pretty amazing device.
Yeah. I was just going to say that when I hear those sorts of things, I'm always struck by the majesty of it, or the awesomeness of the fact that there were past civilizations that marked time in that way, and that they located in this particular region that was also connected to the rulers and the religious rulers, the secular rulers of the civilization. And that in itself, I think, is so cool, and I love it. And I love thinking about actually going to the locations to see it. But a lot of times now, people will say, wow, that's just so amazing. It must have been aliens that did it. And there's so many theories and all of that. But I love the thought. To me, I get so excited about the thought that ancient civilizations organized themselves in ways that they created these sorts of structures. And that the idea of the astronomical alignment and to be in harmony with the solar system, it was vital to their life, and it remains important. I do believe that the astronomical alignments of buildings, of our architecture, of certain placements remains even symbolically significant to this day. But historically, here's the thought that I was having was, it's interesting that secular rulers, starting around the 16th, 17th centuries, started to try to replace the astronomical majesty and signposts, and the focus on the astronomy was replaced by a focus on the leaders. And I'm thinking of Louis XIV in particular, that when he built Versailles, or when he built up Versailles to the palace that it became, there was the mile marker for all of France became right outside the king's window, right? And there was this effort to take the imagery of the new understandings of the solar system, that the sun is the center, but then to take the king and make him be equated with the sun. So they're even borrowing the astronomical imagery in the creation of a secular state. So I don't know. That's what I thought of as you were talking. I don't know whether it connects, but I just wanted to throw it out there.
I think it definitely connects. It also wasn't new. Like if you go to Abu Simbel in Egypt, which actually it's not where it used to be. They dammed the Nile, right? Which sadly just destroyed an entire civilization. I don't want to go there right now, but it also saved a lot of people from potential droughts and such. But many of the old Upper Egypt, which means Southern Egypt, temples were drowned. Some of them were cut into blocks and moved. Like one of them lives in the Met in New York. Some of them were moved in Egypt to places that were above the ground. So like the Temple of Pleiades, like when Isis temple was moved to a new island from the island that was drenched. And Abu Simbel, which is like one of the most just amazing, impressive temples in Egypt, right? Like where the alien thing comes in. And I don't believe that. I just think we used to be better, smarter before civilization fell in some ways. But it's how did you build these things? Like they're so impossible, but UNESCO cut this building into these huge blocks, right? And then moved it block by block to a new location.
A new location that's within Egypt, though, right?
Yeah, within Egypt, it's kind of tricky to get to, but it's definitely worth a visit if you're down there. And they aligned it to the way it was aligned back in the day. And so it's kind of like what you were describing at Newgrange, right? Which is when in Newgrange, the southern extreme rising of the sun. So I call it solstice just because it's when the sun is furthest south. on the horizons, like that shines down the passage grave and illuminates the back wall, right? At Abu Simbel, there were 2 days in the year where a similar phenomena happens. And it was the day that Ramses II was born, and then also the day he was coronated, right? And they got it just slightly off. So I think it's off by a day now or something. But they really, paid attention to that astronomy. Really cool thing there is in the back wall there, when it illuminates, there's 4 statues. And one of them is Ptah, who's like the god of the dark, right? Of like nothingness. And so he's never light. He's never lit. And so the sun comes and it lights the 3 other statues, but not Ptah.
Huh.
That's pretty intriguing. But there's like an example where, 4,000 years ago, we have a ruler setting himself up, as the sun.
Yeah.
Right. In Babylon, we know like the original kind of natal chart readings weren't for each person. They were for the king.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this long standing tradition of like Axis Mundi, right? Where you set up the central location of the village, the town, the city, the world, whatever. So like in Washington, D.C., for example, where I've done tons of work, they have the road that comes out of the White House up to Meridian Park is named for the meridian because that's where they planned the prime meridian to be.
Wow.
Yeah, which is in Greenwich, right? That's like a bunch of white dudes in wigs voted. And
Well,
DC,
it should be in DC. Come on. I always wondered why the United States continued on with Greenwich as the mean line. Like we overthrew everything else. And then we made it American, but
some would say America is only the military branch for the empire, but I don't know that we need to go there right now. But yeah, I mean, or even how did it move to Greenwich in the first place? I've just been working with Astro Gold software on adding new features to their maps, which are amazing, and they're going to be available for people soon. If you play with that software, it's a great one. But one thing I asked them to do was to move or have the option to relocate the prime meridian to wherever you want it to be, or to your own personal prime meridian, or to Giza. Because the Great Pyramid, it's actually the center of the geodetic landmass of Earth. Like if you draw lines from the Great Pyramid in every direction, you will touch more Earth than if you start from anywhere else on Earth. And perhaps it would have been an ancient image for the center of the world. I think that's a very personal and a very local thing. And there's no reason why we should tell folks in Australia that Giza is the center of their world, or for you in California.
right.
And maybe that in a weird way can get me to, what brings us together today, which is that Anne sent me a text or an email the other day asking me about the apparition of the Virgin of Mary in 1531 in Mexico City and the Pleiades, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had talked about, so I do this show, History in the Stars, with David Palmer. And on our last episode, the Virgin of Guadalupe came up. And it was, I don't know, I think we were talking about Neptune and Pisces because Neptune was in Pisces at that time. And then, of course, it happened at the end of when Pluto was at the end of Capricorn. And the church to her was built when Pluto was in Aquarius at some of the very same astrology as now. I think that was 1533 when they built the church. But
is this on your screen, this chart?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But
so I just put a 0 Aries wheel. The first of 3 appearances, or maybe 4, was said to be December 9th, 1531. That would be Julian Calendar. That was before the Gregorian Advent. But yeah, there you see, and let me just put today wrapped around here. So there's these amazing coincidences of Neptune, who's now moving from Pisces to Aries. As we know, that's happening very soon. Pluto, who has just recently moved from Capricorn into Aquarius, right? And you can see at that time in 1531 also Pluto's at the gateway between Capricorn and Aquarius, and then Neptune also here in late degrees of Pisces moving forward. Yeah, and so who brought it up, you or David? David Palmer, for those of you who don't know, and I bet you do, is the Leo King. And HistoryAnne and David have been having a show for some time where my understanding is you, or from my witness, you kind of go into the history and then he looks at the astrology of the time, right?
Yeah, we try to find a time that relates in some way to what we're experiencing today. And it's amazing to me that in our discussions, the sort of connections that come out. And that in this case, I really don't remember. I've got to go back and look at why it came up. But, of course, David was showing how that image of Our Lady of Guadalupe was used by the church, by the Roman Catholic Church at that time, that's been suffering from the Reformation in Europe. People have been starting to break away from the church and question it. Secular rulers are breaking off. Religious wars are starting between the Protestants and the Catholics, between Protestants themselves. So it's kind of a time where you didn't really want to be in Europe, right? It wasn't a pleasant time. There's always a lot of fighting back in that time in Europe, and it probably was never an extremely pleasant place to be. But this was a time where there's a lot of contesting between states and church and state, and Henry VIII's breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church and beheading wives and divorcing and all of that. So the Virgin of Guadalupe turned out to be this story of, what's happening in this miraculous new world where the indigenous people are finding these apparitions that connect with the Virgin Mary. But at the same time, the representation of Our Lady of Guadalupe maintains all sorts of Aztec references in the way that she's communicated to people. And
even
so
the language that she spoke, right? She spoke in Nahuatl, I think.
Yeah, to a peasant who had been.
Sorry, let's rewind. If you could just tell us like what happened from what you know about that experience, because I'm sure I hadn't heard about it until somebody asked me about it recently.
Okay, yeah, it's something that I think, being from Southern California, it's celebrated a lot here. And I did actually, I made a connection and brought it up because I'd been to a service that was honoring Our Lady of Guadalupe on December 12th. And I know that that's the day that people celebrate her. And I knew something about, for a few days before that, people will gather in prayer groups and make their prayers for what sort of the way they'd like the Virgin or Our Lady to intercede in their lives. And she's sort of seen as someone that you can ask for, that she assists the most downtrodden people. And that's the case where when she was seen by an Aztec man, Juan Diego, whose Aztec name I don't remember at the moment, he had converted to Christianity in 1524. So by 1531, he's been Christian for quite a while, and he's working in some way for the bishop of the region. So he was out at Tepeyac Hill, which is where, or actually I did at the time, I started to investigate because I was thinking, why was he on this particular hill? So he's at this hill on December 9th, and he sees this apparition of a woman who comes to him, who's Our Lady of Guadalupe, as we know her now. And she talks to him about wanting to get a message to the bishop about how he should build her a home on this hill, or a church. And he thinks, why would they listen to me? I'm just this peasant guy. And then he goes away. She says she'll be there again the next day. He gets there. She's there. I don't know if it's at that point. I don't think it's at that point where he sees all of these roses and it's winter time, and these Castilian roses don't ever bloom at that time of year. But he goes and there's all these blooming flowers. He goes away, finds out his uncle is sick, and near death. And so he doesn't come back on the next day. He thinks, I don't have time for this. My uncle's dying. I've got to go to his work. So he takes a different way. And on that different path, she still appears to him, tells him his uncle has been healed. And he goes back and he has indeed been cured. So then the final day, he goes up to the hill. She asks him to bring all of the roses to the bishop in his cloak, so that, so he brings the rose. He takes all the roses in his cloak to the bishop. And the idea was, this will be a visible testament. So he'll believe that you actually did see me. He opens the cloak, and then the image is on that cloak, which we think of today as Our Lady of Guadalupe. So,
and I think
and then approaches the goat years later.
This image, but let me just put some images on the screen. And so, like, basically, this type of image would have been. This is probably Juan Diego, right? In the three apparitions.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I don't know, lasered into his cloak, right? And by the way, for those of you who have done your Mary research, typically when you see blue and stars, that's the Virgin Mary, that's the mother of the sun. Whereas if you see orange, I mean, even here it's more kind of an orange and green. That's more typically symbolic of Magdalene in the esoteric tradition. And that the Virgin Mary, right, in the star base would go back to Isis, right? The mother of the sun, Horus or Heru, right? So we have these ancient roots, and it's a fascinating tale that's carried through. Just share, I was down in Tulum doing a retreat with some dear friends some time ago, which actually, come to think of it, it was the time when I met this woman, Claudia, I'll bring back in. But Anna, my partner, and I were down exploring some of the Mayan sites before the retreat. And so I took Anna to the airport so she could get back here to her boy. And then I was heading down to Tulum for the retreat, but I had a teaching that morning for my school of astrology, and I just kind of randomly through Facebook found a friend in Cancun who let me do the talk from their flat in Cancun. And then it was equinox. I was like, man, I want to find a pyramid to go pray at, and get aligned. And so I did a search and I found one, and it was cheap to visit, I thought, but the price that I was reading was not in pesos, it was in dollars. So it ended up being crazy expensive because it was like this amusement park, which has been built around a Mayan burial site, which is the weirdest thing, right? And I was in there and I was just judging everyone so hard because they were in water park clothes, just scurrying past this pyramid, the small pyramid site, and literally these, this burial zones. And so I went to the pyramid site and sat during the equinox moment and did my thing and trying to calm my inner asshole, which is tricky for me to do. I find I'm getting better at it. But anyway, I came out of this place and they had said when I came in that hey, your ticket also gives you access to this demonstration of the ball game, which I've always wanted to see, because in so many of these Mesoamerican traditions, to use the modern terms, many things were seemingly universal, like some of the calendrical systems. The 260-day sacred count was used by the Mexica, the people most of us know as Aztecs, was used by the Mayan, by the Toltec, by the Olmec, right? There were these interesting things that were shared by many civilizations, kind of scattered throughout different locations and also through times in the land that most of us now call Mexico, and down to Guatemala, Belize, etc. Right? So the game, the ball courts that you'll find at many of the sacred sites down there, they have these hoops that are like basketball hoops, but they're sideways. And the game is they would hit the ball off of their hip through that hoop. And anytime I've been told that, it's that's impossible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I was really
remember learning that and thinking no, and seeing the picture in my book. Right? Yeah.
The first one I saw, I think, was at Chichen Itza, which is actually more of a ceremonial center that was it's giant. It would actually be in some ways impossible to get to the hoops because they're really high up. It's like kind of supersized for the gods.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've seen them just, at so many different sacred sites I've visited down there. And so I was excited to see this demonstration. Before I got there, some of my judgment about this place was getting calmed because there were these monkeys and they were part of a zoo. There's wildlife exhibits there as well, but they didn't even seem to be caged. And they were super cool. And I was an hour with this awesome monkey who was laughing at me. And he just kind of really helped me calm down a bit. And then I saw a bunch of different animals along the way and saw that they were better cared for and had more space to do their thing than most zoos offer. And so I started kind of softening, right? And then I got to the show for the ball game, and it ended up being this huge production. And it was fascinating. It starts pure Mayan, and there were flutes and drums. And we're in this huge stadium. Probably 10,000 people. And fortunately, there was translation into Gringo, into English. And they were just kind of telling the story. And then the conquistadors come, right? And then the violins and the trumpets show up with them. And then there's kind of Western instrumentation on one side and the Mayan native instrumentation on the other. And they're having this music battles between the two as the Spanish and the indigenous people are battling in the show down there. It was crazy. And in the end, they erect these crosses in chacmuls, which is an ancient Mayan sacred image. Right. And I'm just whoa, this is really heavy. But then there's all of these dancers who slowly are flipping over these panels that have been laid out on the floor of this giant stadium. And in the end, they reveal the Virgin, right? The image of the Virgin. And the place goes wild. And people have their lighters up. And, there was the one in me of how terrible, this image of conquest and whatnot, but as they're narrating this at the end, they spoke about the new people who are born from the merging of these two different societies and civilizations and people. And it was cool how the Mary, tied it all together and made it a beautiful thing.
Wow.
So the Scorpio conspiracy theorist in me, who is strong, just saw this is the great church vehicle that they used to kind of corrupt these people into Western mind and give this new calendar and some of the things that you and I probably will get to today, right? But then the one in me who was actually just taught by those monkeys and not by my own judgments of people enjoying a water park, right? It was no, this is such a beautiful thing that there is this amazing mergence, right? So there's some terror in that, obviously, and some terrible genocidal things, right? And I feel some of the things that were taught about cultures there and the fascination with sacrifice, for example, in some ways is a vehicle for people to justify this genocide and is greatly exaggerated. That being said, you do see a lot of that in the imagery and walls of skulls and all sorts of other stuff, right? But seeing that kind of celebration of the goddess and of Mary and how that really lit this place up. By the end, I was I got to bring Koa here. It's sorry from this place is terrible to I have to bring Koa here. And sorry for the long story, but just really wanted to share that because I think it's amazing. And as we're looking at, these churches that are built on ancient sites, right? So there's one I love bringing students to, which is in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, which is a very kind of colonial city in Mexico, Spanish city in Mexico. They have an old church that was built on something older, of course, as it usually is. And then the church itself is kind of inside a new church. They constructed a replica of one of the Gothic cathedrals, I think a cathedral in Cologne, Germany, there in San Miguel de Allende. But it's aligned in such a way that the door of the church faces north. And that means the midday sun, which is south, ignites the cross on top of the church. Okay, but as the sun journeys from the Tropic of Capricorn at winter solstice time and starts getting higher and higher in the sky each day, you have to get closer and closer to the church to keep that alignment of the sun on the cross.
Wow.
Right? Which obviously has some interesting symbolism when we hear that term, the sun on the cross. Right? Eventually, because Mexico's in the tropics, where the sun overheads twice a year, you have to actually go inside the church to have the sun on the cross.
Wow.
Really interesting imagery like Vesica Piscis and spires beneath them. So as you're walking towards the church, the spire penetrates the Vesica. I will let each and every one of you do what you want to do with that imagery. But anyway, you get inside the church and they have these amazing different solar calendars, ways that the sun is coming through skylights, ways that the sun is projected onto some paintings that are hung in the back wall. And I just love it as a great example of how even modern architecture, like in DC, we have a lot of this too, will align the sun in this way. So I thought a thing we could do today is try to look at what was going on astronomically back here. So December 9th, 1531 was the first of the apparitions. And is this astronomy software on the screen for you?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And actually you can see a bunch of different calendar dates. I know they'll be pretty small on everyone's screen, especially if you're watching this on a phone or something. If you're watching this on Instagram, come over to my YouTube page, geminibrett.com/YouTube, if you want to see this full screen. But anyway, you can see in the Julian calendar, it's the 9th of December. This was before the Gregorian calendar advent, where we see in Gregorian, it would be equivalent to the 19th of December. We can also see where it is in the Mayan long count, in the Hab, in the Solstice. We get the Egyptian and Hebrew, well, one of the Egyptian and Hebrew years here as well. So I want to have those up because there's an interesting opportunity here on New Year to ask what a New Year actually is and in the calendar. And just because Anne had asked me about the Pleiades in this moment, because if I remember right, your first assumption would be that it had something to do with Venus, yeah?
Yeah, for some reason I always jump to Venus and its placement or its role in calculating Mesoamerican calendars, but also in doing some research. And I know you love this. I thought, well, because I'm just figuring out why is this guy on the hill at this time. And for some reason, even though we started by talking about the solstice, I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking more because I'm close to New Year's. Are they calculating the beginning of a year? So I typed into ChatGPT, what was the beginning of the Aztec or Mayan calendar? I'm trying to, or Toltec, or, which time system is this? Because I know there's so much out there about these calendar systems, and I don't know anything really about it. So something came up that, well, their year reset by the rise of the Pleiades when it hits the horizon, or at rising. I don't remember what, or I guess it would be at nighttime when it's rising at the horizon. You'll be able to describe this more. And I asked ChatGPT, well, when did this happen? And it told me in November. So I thought, oh, well, that's kind of close. And so then I asked you, I was thinking, but this doesn't make any sense. So I sent you an email to ask about the Pleiades, because I know, you named your daughter after one of the Pleiades, and my daughter's name is Maya also, Maia. So I figured, hey, this is the Pleiadian connection. And then
why did you name your daughter Maya?
Well, we like the name Maya, and then we wanted to use the Greek spelling. And I wasn't even thinking about the fact that it was one of the Pleiades until after she was here. So that's how she got her name. And I think it's just funny because Maya is she the mother of Hermes?
Yeah.
So I gave birth to my own mother, being a Gemini rising.
Right, Gemini rising each, which is why I was a guest on another one of Anne's regular shows, which is the Gemini Rising show with Natalie, right? So something I encourage everyone to check out. A link to that playlist is in the description of this show here on YouTube. Anyway, and I've got to get the link for your show with David to put there as well before we're done.
Okay.
Along with, or maybe you could just tell us anywhere that people could find you. Let's do that along the way.
Yeah. And I mean, you can find my Instagram. It's at HistoryAnne. And I have a YouTube channel where I create historical videos that talk about topics I find interesting that relate to my research or that relate also to the astrology and history. But they take a lot more time, and so there's fewer of them there, but I'm building that channel. So follow me there at HistoryAnne. It's HistoryAnne with an E. But yeah, the Pleiadian connection, that's what I was asking you about. And then you came back with, ChatGPT is wrong.
Well, it might be right from the opposite perspective, because you had asked about the heliacal rising of the Pleiades.
Yes.
And yeah, well, let's just talk about history and time and the Pleiades. Like, so many different cultures speak about connections to the Pleiades. Like, we're told by many different indigenous cultures that or at least they come from the Pleiades. And back in like the oldest kind of prototypical zodiac that we're aware of, which is the Mula Pin, or the stars and the path of the moon from Babylon. The Pleiades were called Mul. They were called stars. They were the thing. And from what I understand, or actually maybe what we understand at this point, like the oldest zodiacs were sidereal or star based, and they really were not about following the sun through the stars. You can't do that. You'll go blind trying, right? We follow the moon very easily. When the moon is not with the sun and under the sun's beams, we can watch this moon move through the stars every 27 and a third days, right? So we have these ancient systems that we call lunar mansions from Babylon, from China, from India, the nakshatras, and that seems to be probably the oldest way of keeping star time, moon star time. And this is described in the Mula Pin, and there was like a 17 or 18 constellation path of the moon that later was kind of weeded down to the 12 constellations or signs of the zodiac, and then they made equal solar divisions, right? And this, by the way, is kind of the high five for the Julian count. Because if you're looking at sun time, like if you divide the circle of the sun's path, the zodiac, into 12, as we do, and I'll just hold up the seed of life because I think it best shows the reason why. The sun takes an average of 30.44 days to go through a sign. So I call that a sunth, the sun through a sign. And therefore 30 and a half, right? Was why you alternate between 30 and 31. It's like a solar thing. It kind of cuts the moon out of the mix, and there's a problem there. But anyway, for the Babylonians, and this is true also if you look at solely lunar calendar systems that align their months to moons, to the phases of the moon, like the Hebrew calendar, which came from the Babylonian back to the Akkadian, or the Chinese solely lunar calendar, and others. Typically, they don't start their month with the new moon, as we call it, the moon-sun conjunction, because that can't be seen, right? It's a no moon. So it'd be like the day, or sometimes two, after the conjunction, when we can first see the young moon, Diana's bow, the sliver crescent moon. In Hawaii, they call it the Hilo moon. Hilo means first, in the sunset west. And that's why some of the traditions actually begin days at sunset, because the first day of the month is announced when you see that young moon in the sunset west, right? And then a day later is going to be sunset. And we see the moon from the northern hemisphere point of view, then wax away from the sun from the west towards the east, which is true everywhere. But in the northern hemisphere point of view, that's from the right to the left. And I think that's actually why so many of these cultures also read and write from the right to the left. It's all like lunar stuff, right?
Mm.
So for the Babylonian calendar, though there are many calendars, they also talk about like tracking the length of the shadow on the sundial, which is a tropical thing, and some other tropical stuff. It wasn't all star based. Like back in the Mula Pin, there's all these kind of tropical year recipes as well. But for the solely lunar trip, the new moon is the new month, right? The first visible young moon. But what's like the beginning of the year? And the ideal beginning of the year was when you saw that crescent with the Pleiades.
Mm.
And really, the way that the moon, sun, Earth, moon, sun, that what I call the silver year, and the Earth, sun, the golden year, they synchronize every 19 years. We call it the Metonic cycle now. So you can really only have this ideal crescent young moon with the Pleiades like every 19 years. And then that would be a really specific moment in time that speaks of kind of like the ideal silver year ahead, right? And they were not the only ones to align their year count to the Pleiades. And this brings us into the sidereal year. So when we can never see the sun moving through the stars, you can estimate in two ways, sidereally or star-based. One is when the sun sets, you wait for the sky to darken, and then you look at the zodiac stars that you can first see appearing in the darkness in the west, right? That's where the sun will go next. Or before sunrise, we look for what's called heliacal rising stars. So they are the stars that the sun has just recently passed by, and therefore they rise before the sun. Speaking of the rising sun, what's up, David? Just seeing here. Right. And so heliacal risings have been really important. Like some calendars would start their year with the first appearance of the Pleiades, right, in the morning sky. So the sun has passed them by. I've talked about this a bunch because the whole story of Hermes, like sneaking out of his mother Maya's cave and stealing Apollo's cows, walking them backwards. It's like a full Mercury retrograde story. It's much more, and it's all eventually about the heliacal rising of the Pleiades and of Jupiter. And I saw that the day after our Maya was born. It's like crazy, right? Yeah. Anyway, so there's also what we call the acronicral rise. And in the Hawaiian calendar, which is also solely lunar, so they're using moon phases. They actually have a name for 30 different moon phases in Hawaii, which is pretty amazing, right? They're not doing like 8 or 12, they're doing 30 or 29 alternating, because the average period of illumination, moon, sun, is 29 and a half days. So a lot of the old calendars would alternate between 29 and 30 days to keep that pace, right? But they're working with the so-called acronicral rising of the Pleiades. And this means that the Pleiades rise at sunset.
Okay.
So this might actually be what was happening at that time and at that solstice. And we can play with some charts and see. I'm also fascinated by, like, it was solstice, right? This is another thing that you text. It's like, hey, maybe it's solstice, right? Mm-hmm. And then I'll show you a cool thing about Venus time back then too. So before I leave the acronicral rise thing, there's a period in a sun-star cycle, right? So sun conjunct star, that star is under the beams. We just don't even know it exists in a way. It's blinded by the light. Right before that time, about a month before that time, we see the heliacal setting of that star, which is the sun sets. There's that star in the west. But a day later, the sun's so close that now it's under the beams of the sun. And until the sun conjoins that star and then passes it by, it won't be seen at all for about a month's time, depending on how bright it is, how far it is from the path of the sun. But then we have the heliacal rising of that star, right? It's our first experience of that star before the rising sun, right? Mm-hmm. There's another time, which is when the sun gets opposite to that star, which means the Earth is passing that star, by the way. But interestingly, and back in the day, I think one of the terms that was used was the curtailed passage. Because what happens is that star rises at sunset, but you can't see it because it's too bright out when the sun sets. right? And even though it's on the horizon opposite the setting sun, things are still too lit up. So there's kind of a difficulty with acronychal risings times. Another one being, what about hills and buildings and other things on the horizon that might obscure your view? So is it actually at a time when that star is rising when it's dark enough to see it? Right, there's some issues there. These days in Hawaii, people will just talk about November 7th because that's around the time when the sun is opposite the Pleiades. Actually, that can't be right because the Pleiades are at the Taurus Gemini cusp, so it would really be sun ingressing Sagittarius, right? And they'll just kind of celebrate that at the beginning of the year. But we've just lost this go out and experience it, go out and see it kind of thing, which goes all the way back to the ancient calendar systems. Hesiod's work in days is a really great example from the Greek of working with rising stars in this regard to know when to plant and sow, etc.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question about this. Since I know you've done a lot of stargazing yourself and you've been to a lot of these ancient sites. Have you been there? I'm guessing the amusement park doesn't qualify because it was probably so lit at nighttime by artificial lighting. Have you been to these locations and seen the sky as dark as it would have been seen by the ancient people?
I mean, definitely not as dark as it would have been seen because, you know, there's a hotel I'm staying at across the street or whatever. At an amusement park space, I didn't stay late enough because I was due in Tulum for an opening ceremony thing.
Mm-hmm.
The time I would love to get in, like I have a Facebook friend who's a guard at Chichen Itza.
Wow.
And he's posting these beautiful images of stars and the pyramid of Kukulkan there, which is the pyramid of the feather serpent many people know about because the equinox sunset has the image of the serpent shadow slithering down the pyramid, which is an amazing thing. And he's posting these great pictures of but like this morning he posted pictures of lightning like striking the pyramid. It's great.
Wow.
I should share his name because you should all follow.
Yeah.
It's a really wonderful thing to see. I'll find it as we talk. I have thought about possibly one day, I would never, but sneaking off during the night shows. I just wouldn't do it. But if I had, I would maybe be able to get to places within the pyramid complexes where you could sit at a place and see star alignments because, you know, they close the doors and you have to leave these, you know, pyramid sites, at least the kind of larger ones that are, you know, tourist attractions these days, before sunsets. So even before the sun is like setting for you to get a sunset alignment, they're blowing the whistle to leave. Even you can't get in before the sun rises, you know.
Wow.
But you know, I've dreamed about once maybe going to a nighttime show. They have at some of the larger sites like at Chichen Itza and Uxmal. They have like laser shows, or they're not even laser shows. They're really beautiful, where there'll be loudspeaker kind of narrations of old myths, and then with temples like up on the hillside at Uxmal, they'll light them up in primary colors. And kind of each one of the temples will represent a different character. And I wish I spoke Spanish well enough to know what the heck was going on. But, you know, that was a time where maybe I thought about just sneaking off when the lights go pitch black, as they often do during the show, and sneaking around the corner and trying to watch Orion like walk on temples. And
Yeah. I'm just so curious to see. So for the Pleiades, what could they see with their naked eye? I mean, did they know how many stars were in the cluster?
Well, I don't know. We do, right? Like there's so many there. It has kind of back to ancient times. There's been the story of the seven and the two. So in the Greek, it's the seven daughters of Atlas and Pleione, right? And Atlas and Pleione are together. And then there's the seven daughters, Maya being one of them, the brightest of them being Alcyone. So Electra, Merope, Tejet, on and on we go, right? There's many different myths about the one that disappeared. Some say it was actually Maya, who left her heavenly abode to live a humble life in a cave and on Earth, right? Some say it's Merope, whatever. And so there's some idea that at some point in time, one of the stars that the ancients used to see, one of the bright stars, just kind of disappeared. But the Pleiades are also like a young cluster of stars. There's like many more that we can see. And when you look through like a zoom lens or a telescope, like so many show up.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly with no light pollution, you can get in the middle of the jungle in Mexico or other places I've been. Hawaii is a great example where you can get a pretty good view. It's pretty similar to what the ancients were seeing. And the Pleiades just stand out, it's like, you've seen them. They're just such a beautiful cluster of stars.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not that bright. I have so many moments to embarrass myself, even to myself. So I went and drove away from my house in the clouds and the fog at one night recently to see a lunar occultation of the Pleiades, which is happening in our time. It's like, depending on where the lunar nodes are, every 18 and a half years, you have the opportunity to experience the moon actually blinding the Pleiades from our view, and then they're reborn on the other side of the moon. That's happening with Spica now as well. But Spica is a very bright star, and so you can actually watch a Spica occultation. Like the moon will rise before Spica and then pass in front of that star before together they set. I went to see with the Pleiades, and you just couldn't see anything. It was just moon.
Yeah.
Intriguingly, like the Pleiades, they're not that bright.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're just so clustered together that they have an appearance of something bright. So if I didn't have my zoom lens, like I wouldn't even notice the Pleiades then. But I got to learn a lot about what an occultation was. So like, why is that place important? So many different origin stories speak not only about the Pleiades, but that zone of the heavens. Like we have old stories. Some of them are pretty horrendous about like Orion chasing the Pleiades, or in Australia there's this old man chasing the Pleiades. Some Native American stories about Orion chasing the Pleiades, like the story of the Bear's Den, which people call Devil's Tower. Was this bear chasing these, some say boys, some say girls, some say both, some say one of the girls thought about becoming a bear and did, and chased her siblings. And they all prayed for help, and then the rock sprang out of the ground and brought them up to the heavens. And that Devil's Tower, or the Bear's Den, has all these weird bear gouges on it because the bear was trying to climb up after them. But then they became the Pleiades, right? You have these horrendous story about this kind of like this figure chasing the Pleiades, but Orion chases the Pleiades through the sky, right? So it's just astronomy, But we have stories about coming from, well, like in Egypt, the sun, right, was born, Horus was born through this virgin birth, right? His parents, to use the Greek terms, were Osiris and Isis. And Osiris had been cut into a bunch of pieces, and they put him back together, but there was a piece missing, which was a very necessary piece to make a hair, right? And so Thoth, or Jehuti, creates this magical kind of golden phallus for him, and Isis turns herself into a bird and flies above it and becomes pregnant. And then she births Heru, who is the son and the avenger, who's going to avenge his father's death. Osiris goes through the Duat, through the underworld, and becomes the stars we know as Orion in the sky. It's kind of like a more beautiful image for Orion than the hunter, right? The Babylonians, it was the true shepherd of Anu. When Julius Schiller like Christianized the heavens to wipe the pagan off of them and make them holy, Orion was Saint Joseph. So interestingly, the father of the virgin birth in some ways, like less so with Joseph than with Osiris, right? But it's like the father of the sun. And astronomers would smack me for saying this because it's not thought that the Orion Nebula, which lives in Osiris's sword, is old enough to be the nebula where our star, the sun, was born. But I think these tales are telling us that. And actually, for the Mayan people, there's stars of Orion, the easternmost belt star and the 2 feet star, Rigel and Siph, that they say are the hearthstones And they build a triangle of hearthstones, a tortilla griddle on every home in the village, because they're said to surround the smoke of creation, which is the Orion Nebula. I believe the Pleiades and so many of the stars in that zone of the sky and our star were all born in that particular manger or birthplace. But I don't know. So we can see a couple of things. One is back then in 1531, was that the acronychal rising of the Pleiades, right? It certainly was not the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, because that is around June, July. Things would be different 500 years ago because of precession, but not that different, right? But the acronychal rising of the Pleiades is around the time that the sun ingresses Sagittarius. So we're not too far off from that. Is it a Venus thing? And the reason why I assume you went to, well, it's probably not Venus, because at this time, I cast December 9th, which is the first apparition. Venus is with the sun, right? She's under the beams of the sun.
Right.
There is a chance that this morning was the last time Venus was seen before she went back behind the sun from Earth's point of view and disappeared for a couple months. But it probably happened a week or even 2 weeks before that time. So that's likely not it. But definitely when we're looking at Mesoamerican time, to assume Pleiades or to assume Venus is on track, right? Because they had calendars aligned to the Pleiades. They tracked the Venus sun cycle to amazing precision. Right, we have archaeological or anthropological evidence of Venus tables, like in codices, but also in some architecture that like work to our time, and I think another couple thousand years into the future. They were like tracking the Venus cycle well. Okay,
right.
So this, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much here, but
well, I'm learning so much at the same time. So thank you for talking. I said I'm learning so much at the same time. So
right on. Yeah, I mean, when Anne asked me to do this, I had a quick look and I was like, why don't we just do this together?
Yeah.
Because it would be interesting for people. So Claudia, who I mentioned meeting at that retreat in Tulum, which was with my dear friend Ursula Stockter, is a wonderful astrologer in Mexico, and some other astrologers. The story goes that she discovered an ancient codice. She's a historian like yourself. And she was rumbling around in one of the libraries in Mexico. And like in between books, or maybe even in the pages of a book, one of the ancient codices fell out.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, like we don't have many of them, right? So I'm just reading your comment, Melinda. Interesting. I thought Ursula meant bear, but I'm seeing you're writing Ursula means of the north. And of course, the bear, Ursa Major, points to the North Star. Yeah, and so anyway, this is called the Venus Codex. And unfortunately, it's like not quite available yet. So let me just leave that there, but hopefully it's going to come out and become available to the public and not just historians in the know or people who are lucky enough to get a PDF email to them at some point.
Well, you know, just to say something on that point, I think it's rare, though, for a historian to find a document like that and then to connect with somebody who knows about astronomy and astrology. So I think we have got a lot of that out there. You can find bits and pieces, but no one's really studied the connections between the astrology and astronomy and different historical periods. I mean, so it's difficult to find that information if you've got those questions. And I do think it's important that we understand it, even that we continue to create architecture that aligns with these things even today. And I mean, there's so many ways it shapes our lives. And for us to get a real understanding of the people from the time, we have to know the astronomy, because, you know, a lot of their time awake was dark. And they needed to understand also the seasons. I mean, it's not an accident that one of the first things that started to be printed when the printing press came out was an almanac. So people could, you could communicate easily, more regular and mathematically calculated information about astronomical phenomena. So
Right. But what do you lose, right? There's this old story of Jehuti, who many of you will know as Thoth or Thoth, that when humanity was falling from consciousness, right? So there weren't aliens who built these sites. We were just like of a higher vibe back then. Some would suggest. Anyway, so we start falling, and this is how it works. And then again, we will rise starting today. Happy New Year, everyone. But so Jehuti then creates language and writing. So the idea was, because we were destined to just forget all of this wisdom that we had found along our way, that if we had the ability to write, we could record that, and history was born, right? Not just oral history anymore, but actually the written books in the libraries. And he goes to those higher than him to brag of this amazing creation. He says, I have preserved human memory. And they say, you fool, you have destroyed human memory. So because that almanac that now tells you when to plant and sow eliminates the necessity to wake up before the sun and to track the stars. Right. So just like, we could go to Stonehenge and see the amazing solstice equinox alignments there. People do. This is the cool thing about Stonehenge, is they actually let you in a few days of year to celebrate those alignments. I'm just now discovering lunar standstill alignments there, and I'm sure I'm not the first to. But like, to go see that, I would have to like rent out Stonehenge in the middle of the night, and I can't afford it,
But a big group of us could, so maybe we should.
We could. September 1st, 2025. Let's talk about it, people.
Yeah.
It's a really good date to experience this thing, clouds allowing, and it is crop circle season out there. I was thinking about it because I was invited to speak out there in England right around this time, and it was just like this, like a lot with the baby in the house and all that too.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, like back in the day, that is your greatest entertainment, nature. Right? At nighttime, the stars, if you're not asleep. And as we've been saying again and again, like the calendar systems in a sense are necessary because we need food to live, and the food comes with the seasons. And so keeping the phase of the moon is great because it's a shorter cycle of time, but they don't work the seasons. And so the Earth sun cycle is also something that, of course, all of the ancients everywhere were also aligned with, and we can align ourselves with that. So I really encourage everyone at this time of year. It's still solstice, really, like the sun is so slow at its turnaround points, to go see where the sun is rising now on your horizon, or a place where you can see sunrise, or see where the sun is setting. Like, really just map it, and then see over the course of the next 6 months, as the sun is heading to its northern extreme, see how it goes on the horizon. Like, you can build your own circle. You can be one. You can be your own axis mundi, and it's highly recommended, So, and calendars are a really cool gift, including they at least just let you celebrate, have a ceremony, and flip from the old to the new. Before we went live, Dr. Anne here and I were speaking about how I'm down for any new year, right? Like, if this is your new year, great. Let's put this comment on the screen. David says, many people in history had second sleep and were up at night to socialize and eat and make love. We stopped that in the last 150 years. That's intriguing to hear.
Yeah, it is true. I actually also, David and I need to do a show on this because he's brought that up a few times. And I did research for a historian when I was a master's student. And the historian was writing a book called Nighttime in the 18th Century. It's Roger E. Kirch, if anybody wants to look it up. And it talks all about what was going on at nighttime, and how it really, he was especially looking at how the introduction of streetlights and regular pavement, how did that shape the English world, right? From England to the colonies. In what ways did that change things? And of course, it coincides with industrialization. So it makes it more possible then for people to follow an industrial calendar, when you start to impose this idea of, okay, you should only be outside while the street lights are on. And after that, everyone needs to be locked up away in their homes. And so then that is when our concept of time and nighttime changed. But yeah, people did. I mean, when you think about, in especially places like Northern Europe, how much of the year would be dark in the winter, right? You can't just decide, okay, it's bedtime. We're gonna all sleep and hibernate now.
For 18 hours.
Yeah, things were going on. So
intriguing. Yeah, I guess I'm one of those people because I never sleep through the night. There's always a period where I get up and go out, be with the stars if they allow. It's not just the prostrate. Steezy says Electra, who, yes, is one of the Pleiades as well, but how fun, because also as we went from those street lamps to electricity and, heat in the home and all these things, like we have changed so much over the last many years. There's this other comment here. Thank you, Rahima. So yeah, Ursula means female bear. And intriguingly, the big bear constellation Ursa Major points to Polaris, right? Points to North Star. Ties into Maya as well. Maya raised the daughter of the bear, who was Callisto, because Callisto was pregnant with Zeus's child. And Hera didn't like that at all. So she turned her into a bear. And then her son, Arctus, who was a great hunter, who was raised by Maya because he was orphaned through this experience of his mother becoming a bear, was out hunting one day. And mom saw her son and came and said, I love you. But he heard roar. And so he goes to shoot the bear with an arrow. And Zeus saw this and threw them both into the sky. Some say it's the big bear and the little bear. Big Dipper, Little Dipper live in those constellations, or some say she is the big bear and he is Arcturus, right? The bear keeper, because that star kind of pulls the bear around the sky. But just a reminder that we have so much astronomy in our ancient stories. And when I say our, I'm not Greek, but like those stories that many of us are familiar with, and to kind of retrograde back to something you were mentioning beforehand, like it's kind of easier for the Mesoamerican study to link back into, the astrology, or at least like star omen and timing omen, because it's very clearly shown in, the Mayan traditions, the Olmec, Toltec, and other traditions that, modern anthropologists, historians are studying. And so it's a little bit easier to go from that place to, oh, what did this have to do with the Pleiades? What did this have to do with the omens of Venus and therefore Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, right? Whereas in the West, of course, there's been such a crazy schism between academia and sky omens that it's like faux pas to even go there. I mean, interestingly, kind of the only acceptable astrology study in the West these days, I mean, I shouldn't say it that way, but I should say in academia, right? Like, I'm interested in hearing if you have to hide your astrology in your university setting, but is in history of astrology, like that's a accepted study. And now, fortunately, in archaeoastronomy, in that like the academics can no longer deny that, yes, indeed, Stonehenge is aligned to these astronomical events. That was denied for a long time, and not long ago. That was seen as just like, quacks who were out there playing with the stone circles and thought they were more than they are. And now the field of archaeoastronomy has been born. It wishes to, and we have a lot of astrologers now studying archaeoastronomy, wants to link back into the myths, wants to link back into the astrology, because of course they should all be one and the same. So let's just take a break, because I would love to ask you, we should have started here. What came first, history or astrology? You teach history in the academic setting, right? And astrology, speak in there.
So I do not bring up astrology with my students. I'll bring it up if it relates historically, and definitely my colleagues, I probably wouldn't bring up astrology in everyday talk. But you asked what came first. astrology came first for me because my mom was into astrology, and I grew up reading astrological books that she had around the house and just thinking it was interesting. And then going into the academic setting is where I learned, oh, I should be hiding this. I should be hiding this part of myself. Or if you're looking for deeper meaning in synchronicities that seem to come up in history, right? You learn really fast the academic language. And I'm happy now to be seeing that more people are comfortable speaking about these things that they happen to see. I think it's more and more, or not more and more, it's becoming something I've noticed a little more frequently. And I think it's I love history. I love the stories of history. I think history should be taught in a way that we learn from it, and not in the way that if we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it, because I don't believe that. We all know history. We know the lessons, we know the things people do, but we still don't see it if we're doing the same thing. So I don't necessarily believe that's why. But I think, for example, when you talked about the whole spectacle of the Aztec ball game, and I can't think of what it's called, um, uh, and the music that was involved. It's all telling this history through music, through the actions that you were witnessing. But at the end, for the whole Our Lady of Guadalupe image to come out and for people to cheer, for the whole stadium to be cheering about that, tells you that historically there is significance to these otherworldly things, that people make connections and that those connections last over time, and people embrace historical legacies in ways that define who they are today. So I'm always interested in learning more about what history means to us right now. And I think it's very important right now, especially with the advent of AI, because and I've seen in recent years a lot of efforts to retell history or to
Mm,
make it more difficult to find facts, um, even with more and more sources being available digitally. There's a lot of I feel like there's even been deliberate attempts to make our history to obscure a lot of the history, and
of
it's always
course.
usually the history that empowers people. So I'm a huge
That's
history
also
advocate.
beautifully said, and we're lucky and fortunate to have historians like you who came to history because of research of cosmic cycles, and hopefully we can image a world where astrology will be taught in schools and links like this again. I don't think we're too far away. It really is gaining in so much popularity, and this idea of just history, or especially academia, kind of dusting things under the rug because it doesn't fit. In Egypt, it's interesting. Like if you just hire kind of most of the tour guides there, I mean, most of them are Muslim, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the world in that context is not as old as some of the archaeological dating of some of the sites, right? The Earth is only so many thousands of years old,
Hmm.
and so there's some sites that you can't visit because they're older than the world. But
Wow.
there's an issue there, right? I remember I
Mhm.
had a friend who was studying for a PhD in architecture some years ago. Gosh, probably 15 years ago now. And I was so fascinated by Göbekli Tepe then, discovered at the border of Turkey and Syria, right? Because it really it was so old, and it just breaks the anthropological and model that's been taught for so long. And she hadn't even been taught about it in school. It's like the most exciting site. She was studying for a PhD in architecture, and it was not taught. Or sorry, a PhD and what's the word I'm looking
Was it
for?
archaeology or?
Thank you. In archaeology, and it
Mhm.
hadn't been taught. because it
Oh.
completely betrayed the textbooks that so many of the professors had written or had been preaching for so long. Like, it just breaks the model, you know, and when something comes along
Mhm.
that breaks the model, it's so hard for us to accept it. But like Nadine just wrote here, and I've seen some pictures of this, the
Mhm.
Getty, which is close to you now, has an exhibit on medieval astrology. When I was last there, I went to see a alchemy exhibit there,
Mhm.
which is amazing. They had one of the Ripley scrolls, right? And so, yeah, we're going to see it kind of arriving more and more. Okay.
Mhm.
So anyway, when Claudia asked me about this, because also she had found this Venus codice, they were also working on a site in near Mexico City. It's further away. That's just being recently kind of uncovered, and there seemed to be some alignments, or she was working with me to see if there were some alignments to where Venus would be rising back then.
Okay.
And Venus rises, for those of you who have studied the Venus star, right, from Earth's point of view, Venus aligns with the sun once every, let me say, 19-ish months, 583.92 days, but who's counting? And that's like Venus retrograde between Earth and the sun, right? Halfway through the cycle, Venus will go behind the sun. And both of those conjunctions, interior and exterior, to use the astronomical terms, inferior and superior, they together over the course of 8 Earth years, which are 13 Venus years, paint a 5-pointed star in Earth's zodiac. All right. Well, so Venus in the Aries cycle that will begin in March will rise in a different place on the horizon, her heliacal rise, than she did in August of 2023 in the Leo cycle, at least from my point of view, would be wrapping up in March, right? And that Leo cycle will be reactivated 8 years from now. It's actually 8 hubs, which is the term for the Mayan or the Yucatec term for the annual calendar, which is 365 days without a leap year period.
Okay.
Because the Venus star, it's 8 years minus 2 days, right? Those 2 days being kind of the leap time if we use modern kind of approach, right? Um, and so looking at the Venus star is also interesting because it connects this time and now. So as you were saying, and you and David had been looking at Neptune and Pluto, which is pretty amazing. So here we have this December time in 1531 when the Virgin appears to Juan Diego. And then here's today. And again, like Pisces, Neptune at the end of Pisces, heading for Aries, which will happen very soon. Pluto and Capricorn heading for Pluto and Aquarius. So if we looked some years ago, it's even more aligned. It really shows you this cool thing. Also in the United States right now, right? Chart 1776 chart, Pluto return, but Neptune opposition.
Mhm.
Because a Pluto cycle of about 250 years is 1.5 Neptunes. Neptune being about 165 years. They're in this rhythm, which is 3 for Neptune for every 2 Plutos, 3 over 2, right? And so when we go back 1.5 Neptunes and 1 Pluto, we get to the 1776 time. When we go back 3 Neptunes and 2 Plutos, that brings us back to this early 16th century, this Virgin of Guadalupe time. So that's amazing. There's another piece, and it's something I had found before when Claudia had asked me, and I was amazed to find, is it linked to her personally as well, is that the Venus star. So the Venus star, which again, like this star is drawn. I went, by the way, to astroseek.com where they have these really cool astro tools you can play with. This is under the planetary cycles tools and planetary conjunctions. I've asked this to show me, let me start currently, all of the retrograde Venus. Oh, it's gone. Retrograde Venus Sun conjunctions from the years, let's go 2000 to 2050. And so here's this one in 2023 in Leo. In 2025, we have Aries. Then we'll go Scorpio, Gemini, Capricorn, Leo, Aries. Then we'll go to Libra. We have a sign change happening now. Gemini, Capricorn, Leo, Aries. The Aries is also shifting back to Pisces now because the star itself very slowly retrogrades through the zodiac, about 2 degrees every 8 years minus 2 days. Okay. Well, look at where the Venus star was back here. So I just asked 1500 to 1550. So in 1531, we have the last Aries star point before the star shifted back into Pisces. Scorpio shifting to Libra back then too. Now it hasn't gone all the way around, and I don't. We're kind of out of time, so I don't want to lose us here too much right now. But just compare this star, this shift from Aries to Pisces, 1531 to 1539 to now. 2033 to 2041. Scorpio to Libra, 2026 to 2034. Back then, 1524 to 1532, right? So that's another kind of amazing link besides this Neptune-Pluto thing that you and David were talking about. Also the Venus star back then in the Virgin of Guadalupe time, right? So let's look at Venus a little bit. Let's look at the Pleiades. I actually drew up Tepeyac Hill in Google Earth so we can see where the hill is aligned. Maybe it's aligned to the solstice.
Okay.
Because interestingly, they're celebrating this on December 12th now, as you shared, because it happened in December 12th back then in 1531, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was solstice.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of the issue of calendar corruption or losing the astronomy of the calendar because of the Gregorian Advent, right? They just kind of added or took out 10 days.
Right.
Right. I think it moved from October 10th to October 20th. 1 year.
I don't ever remember when it did for the
14th.
Spanish Empire because I look for England when it happened in September of 1752. So I don't ever remember the exact date for this earlier time, but yeah,
Right.
they
And
lost 10
because
days.
like the Catholics all would have been on board
Yeah.
right away, right? Obviously, they're still like in some Orthodox traditions, still resisting that shift. And people are still keeping the Julian count. There was resistance in France, whatever. And so it took some time for others to get on board. But I would imagine that in Spain, since it was so Catholic, they probably shifted right away. Yeah. But regardless, it seems to me like if you really want to celebrate this thing, instead of 12/12, which look, that's an astrologer's dream. We love 12s. Why not on the solstice? Because it was on the solstice back then. Okay. So, the reason why we might look for the Pleiades in the first place and say, well, this time it couldn't have been a Venus thing because Venus is just behind the sun. And while they're at amazing places of the zodiac, like here's an image, Venus and the sun back then were near the galactic core. Many people these days will think of galactic center as 27 tropical Sagittarius. Sorry about that. But because of precession, that was not true back then. The Capricorn point has precessed like deeper into the Milky Way over these centuries. But regardless, like Venus is so close to the sun that we're very likely, Venus would not have been seen before sunrise. I'm going back by days here, and it probably was a week or even 2 weeks before when Venus disappeared as a morning star for her time behind the sun, which takes a couple months. So that's likely not what we're looking at. Is it a Pleiadian thing? So let me go to, and this is Stellarium, the brilliant Stellarium astronomy software. Let's go to December 12th, 1531, and we'll take it to sunset. And then dim the lights and where are the Pleiades in the sky? And they're way up here. So really, I'm going back by days here. that like acronychal rising of the Pleiades would have been earlier back then than it is now. I would say probably November 1st or even earlier would have been that. So I don't think that's the key either.
Mm-hmm.
But let's look like, how about just solstice? I mean, literally December 12th, Julian count back then was the solstice. I can see the sun. Let me take the sun to like kind of midday position on December 12th, 1531. And then Stellarium's telling me that its longitude at the time is 270.04. Okay, that's 0 Capricorn, tropical. That's solstice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of sounds like a solar thing. Is it the sun born of the Virgin? Let's go to sunrise, because a thing that does happen around Christmas time, let me rewind before sunrise, is you get the Virgin in the east before the sun rises. That might look like the sun being born of the Virgin. It's hard to say if that's exact. It'll actually look closer centuries and centuries from now, and was like kind of less removed back then, especially a couple thousand years ago. But maybe there's something to that. We can also just see, and I have this set for Mexico City, like where on the horizon the solstice sun rises. This would be the same as it is now, or it changes with the tilt angle of Earth changing. And the answer is like 115 degrees azimuth, or 15 degrees, or no, 25 degrees south of east. Someone at my door, and I might have to get that. But so here's Tepeyac Hill. How do you pronounce it, Anne?
Tepeyac.
Okay, let's see how that's aligned.
And
it's like 50. So, I mean, like, here's the church that was built. That would be another thing to pursue, to see how, is this the church here? It must be, right?
I don't know what that is. I feel like the basilica today, is it right there next to the hill?
Yeah, there's like a tower right here. Because I would imagine that these people would have preserved the tradition if it was indeed like a solstice alignment. And it is definitely, so 224 up here, we're at like 35, which means down here, actually, yeah, this is like that 120. It's so hard to do this when I'm not on the ground and just like working with shadows myself. Sorry, I'm also trying to, clear you out. Let's try this. Come on. It's not letting me play. So 126. Yeah, I don't think that's it either. But my feeling is that your hunch that this is a solstice thing is on point.
Yeah,
it really is Earth Sun.
I did find out, doing a little more research, that at that time of year, from the 9th to the 12th, that they would have had sentries posted on that hill looking towards where the sun rose, and that at that point they're waiting for the sun to come back up for the solstice, so that they know there'll be another year. So
I'm trying to make this only you, because I got to go grab the door real quick. But actually, it's like a weird place, and I'm sorry to rush off. I think probably the better move here is for us to make this an end. We did a lot. We went all over the place.
Yes, we did.
And I want to just thank you, Anne, for letting me go on these long rants of archaeoastronomical explanation. And end with, I have so much gratitude for those like you who are courageously bringing astrology, even if you're doing that in the confines of your own consciousness, into the academic setting, because I do feel that we are going to see astrology become at least more accepted as a historical study, and hopefully as a practice one of these days, and that we can all go get astrology degrees and PhDs in university someday. Time will tell.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me and for explaining all of this. And I look forward to talking to you more about these issues and more things that I uncovered as I was doing this research. But that's for another show.
Right on, my treat. And hey, friends, we're going to experience like the highest moon in our sky and when the nodes shift on January 10th, 11th. That's what I'm going to be speaking about next week. I just want to share that if you live in the Portland, Oregon area, I'm going to be doing a live talk. And so be on my mailing list, which you can sign up for at GeminiBrett.com. And again, one more time, where can people find you?
You can find my Instagram and YouTube at HistoryAnne. History, ANNE.
All right, and I'll put that in the description below. Thanks, everyone, for supporting Storytelling Hour. Please like the video, share it around, help us pet the algorithm, and we'll see you in space.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.